Hey everybody, I'm Michigan J, and today on Alternative Placement Art History, I'm going to do that thing where I pick a work of art or a genre that everybody hates and try to convince you that it doesn't suck.
Oh, I hate these.
Today we're talking about landscape paintings, the art world's version of that kid in school nobody liked because they ate glue, reminded teachers about homework, and always had Lunchables for lunch and never shared, ever. Like anyone would even want those stupid, delicious crackers with the individually sized deli meats and cheeses that you could stack into little cracker sandwiches that you would have called crackwitches because you were 9 and didn't understand what crack was yet. 4th grade sucked.
Landscape paintings. Humans have always hated landscape paintings. They're the worst. So boring. No gruesome deaths. No nudity. And as Ron Swanson once said, I think it's pointless for a human to paint scenes of nature when they can go outside and stand in it.
So why waste time on them as an artist if there are so many better alternatives to choose from? Dragons, chill dudes on horseback, massive strawberry eating contests, and other gluttonous fruit-related orgies. Even in the art world, landscapes don't get a lot of respect. First one wasn't even painted until around 1650 BCE, which is pretty late in the art history timeline, when some random Minoan painted the spring fresco, and it didn't really catch on. Nevertheless, landscapes have persisted, both in the real world and in paintings. And they're the type of paintings that really require an understanding of context to fully appreciate. So I picked a couple of works from the AP curriculum to help us understand why certain artists and cultures seem to love landscapes so much, as well as the hidden meanings that make them much cooler than they appear.
Because they appear to suck. Just wanted to drive that point home.
We're going to skip the spring fresco and jump straight to Song Dynasty China, because they were the first ones to really embrace landscapes as more than just a representation of nature. Song Dynasty lasted from 960 to 1279 CE, and this is when monumental landscape painting became the greatest symbol for culture and civilization. For the Chinese, nature wasn't something to be subdued or exploited, or even passively admired. It contained an ideal beauty, balance, and harmony, and sacred energy. They believed that in nature they could find an example of how human society should be run. And Chinese society was a mess in the 10th century. Tang Dynasty fell apart in 907. It was followed by 50 years of political turmoil and upheaval. During this time, lots of philosophers and artists and nobility turned their backs on the chaos and corruption of city life and sought refuge in the countryside. The mountains gave them a place for renewal, purification, and an understanding of how humans fit in the world. And landscape painting then became the primary way for them to express their new philosophy of self-cultivation and harmony with nature. Their new philosophy wasn't new. We call it Neo-Confucianism because it was a throwback to the traditional Chinese philosophy of Confucianism. It was started way back in the 3rd century BCE. That had kind of fallen out of favor as old-fashioned. This was now reinterpreted in their current context, along with a lot of the influence from the Buddhist philosophies that had dominated China throughout the Tang Dynasty. Neo-Confucianism wasn't about trying to achieve enlightenment or escape the cycle of suffering or understand that nothing is real and move on to nirvana. It was about accepting that the here and now is very real, and that through communing with nature, personal moral cultivation, logic, and reason, we can create a moral society. First work of art for today is called Travelers Among the Mountains and Streams by Fan Quan, who was one of those guys that couldn't stand the chaos and corruption of city life and packed his bags for the misty mountains.
Zeppelin.
This work is typical of Chinese landscapes in that it's ink on paper. So instead of using color to create the scene, the artist is using subtle shades of gray and black to create the forms. It's also imaginary. It doesn't actually represent a real place.
Oh, is that what imaginary means?
Well, inspired by the real Chinese mountainous landscape, it's an attempt to represent a political, philosophical, social, cultural ideal, rather than recreate a real place that you go see in real life.
It's really a mashup of 3 different scenes. You can see these little spaces in between the main sections. And Fan Quan has basically taken 3 different views and put them together in this one image. So you got the rocks and the boulders in the foreground, the dense tangled forest in the middle, and then in the background, those tall, imposing mountains. Mountains are given a special and often sacred role in many, many cultures. The ancient Mesopotamians built ziggurats, which were basically man-made mountains, and put their temples up on top. The Greeks set aside the highest point in every city, called it the Acropolis, and put their temples up on top. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, Moses received the Ten Commandments on a mountain. For Muslims, Muhammad received the words of the Quran on a mountain. The ancient Greeks, the Aztecs, and Hindus, all their gods lived in mountains.
Not unlike the tragic protagonist of The Lord of the Rings, Sauron the Great. Middle-earth's greatest goldsmith forged the One Ring in a mountain before that jerk Frodo ruined it. Sauron 2020, baby.
Now you may be thinking, where are the travelers?
Nope.
Travelers are actually a small part of the overall composition. They're off kind of tucked away on the bottom right of the painting, coming out of the forest, walking along the path, driving their donkeys next to this stream. And even though they're the main part of the title, they're clearly not the focal point of this painting. They are dwarfed by the landscape.
Whoa, dwarfed? Come on, you can't say that, man. Not in Sauron's America.
Emerging from that dense tangle of gnarled tree branches, walking down the path, driving their donkeys, soon to pass behind those boulders in the foreground, they're really rendered insignificant in the face of that gigantic mountain in the background. If you look closely, there's a temple tucked away on the right side. And this human-made structure, this product of great skill and ingenuity, doesn't impose itself on the landscape. Rather, it emerges harmoniously from the trees. This is the image of the ideal balance between humanity and nature that the Neo-Confucianists were interested in. The message is clear. Humans have their place, but they are a very small part of a much larger reality. Even the artist's signature is cleverly hidden in the trees rather than standing out. It's an image of how studying and communing with nature can lead one to become a better person, and that living by these principles, rather than the accumulation of wealth and military power, will hopefully produce a more peaceful and civilized society. Like the Chinese, a group of 19th century European painters also turned to nature as a way of expressing their dissatisfaction with modern society. But unlike the Neo-Confucianists, the Romanticists were not interested in logic and reason. In their minds, the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment were products of logic and reason and were destroying the environment, exploiting the poor, and basically ruining society.
That's ridiculous. Humans didn't play any part in the Industrial Revolution.
So they abandoned logic and reason, creating compositions that ranged from chaotic and creepy to peaceful and pastoral, all the time pitting humans against the sublime power of nature. The Hudson River School, an offshoot of this movement in the United States, was the first great group of American artists, and they focused on dramatic landscapes, often of the western frontier. Thomas Cole was their leader, and he painted the Oxbow in 1836. The Oxbow is just its nickname. Its actual name is View from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after a thunderstorm. So that's what we're going to call it.
Seriously?
Like Travelers Among the Mountains and Streams, View from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after a thunderstorm
Come on.
presents a vision of the balance between nature and humanity, but with some significant differences. Cole splits View from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after a thunderstorm
Such a jerk.
into two halves. On the left, we can see a vision of the wild and destructive power of nature. We see the remnants of the thunderstorm referenced in the title. Dark skies, lightning, exploded tree trunks are all evidence of an especially violent storm. On the right side, in the wake of the storm, however, Cole's vision of how humanity interacts with nature splits somewhat from Fan Quan's. While small, like Fan Quan's Travelers, Cole's humans are not simply just walking through nature, they are transforming the land through farming.
What? Transformers?
So what are we supposed to make of this? Is this an image of a peaceful and harmonious interaction between humanity and nature? Or is this a symbol of humanity's rightful control and dominance over nature?
I don't know.
Like many other Hudson River School paintings, View from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after a thunderstorm
Please stop.
is an image that has become linked with Western expansion in the U.S., even though the setting is obviously not in the West.
Wait. Where's Massachusetts? South?
Manifest destiny was the ideology that justified westward expansion, a belief that it was our destiny, ordained by God, to expand our territory all the way to the Pacific, regardless of the indigenous inhabitants.
Doesn't the Bible say something about thou shalt not kill? Oh, here it is. Thou shalt not kill unless they are impeding the expansion of the United States of America. Checks out.
It was Cole's students in the Hudson River School that provided a sort of propaganda for westward expansion. Albert Bierstadt and Frederick Edwin Church depicted scenes of the dramatic beauty that awaited people who moved out to the frontier. a movement of people that was fraught with peril for the pioneers and especially disastrous consequences for the indigenous people. In light of all this, it's not surprising that view from Mount Holyoke,
Honestly,
fine, the Oxbow, has been interpreted by many as a symbol of humanity civilizing the savage landscape. You have a clear juxtaposition of the wild, chaotic natural landscape on the left with the peaceful, pastoral, man-made landscape, or manscape, on the right.
no, please don't call it that.
There's even a hidden message on a mountain in the background. That's right, Mount Doom in the distance. Thomas Cole is basically swearing fealty to Sauron and pledging his talents for use in the Dark Lord service. Actually, the hidden message is just right of center. Now, there is some debate about this, but the traditional interpretation is that what appears to be a clearing on the side of the mountain in the background are actually Hebrew letters that, if read upside down, spell the word Shaddai, or the Almighty. Now, I can't read Hebrew, and so I can't comment personally on that.
Not with that kind of attitude.
But I will say that some Hebrew scholars have said this is a bit of a stretch. Whether Cole intended this section to be Hebrew letters or not, that has been the traditional interpretation. So was this Cole's way of underscoring the message of manifest destiny? That God is out there, watching over and guiding the expansion of the country?
The way you're asking that makes me feel like you're setting us up for a dramatic reversal.
Actually,
Here we go.
Cole hated the idea of industrialization and expansion. He was sharply critical of Andrew Jackson, who was president at the time, and his expansionist policies. He had seen the impact of industrialization in his home in England. Pollution, exploitation, poverty. Just like the European Romanticists, he was disillusioned with industrialization and wanted to capture an image of these pristine natural settings before they were lost to expanding cities and development. In fact, he painted the Oxbow in part because Mount Holyoke had become such a popular tourist spot that it was starting to lose its untamed natural appeal, annoying Cole and possibly making him the first hipster. Cole was an environmentalist and a Christian, and so he felt that you could find God in nature. And so he saw industrialization and urban sprawl as the destruction of God's creation. Now, if those are Hebrew letters on the mountain in the background, it's more likely that his message is a warning against the destruction of nature for what he decried as utilitarianism. For Cole, God is in the mountain. This is precisely what Fan Quan felt, which is fascinating considering the two men had no knowledge of each other, came from entirely different cultures, followed completely different religions. But both men found a connection to a higher spiritual power in nature and conveyed those feelings by painting landscapes. Even if those aren't Hebrew letters on the mountain in the background, I think we can come to the same conclusion. They look like scars on the landscape, and they likely represent the type of scars that strip mining operations would leave. Again, pointing not to a celebration of expansion, but a warning against it. On a lighter note, Cole included another hidden gem in the painting, himself. In the foreground, you can see an artist at his easel, looking back at us as he paints the scene in front of him. Cole painted himself, painting the painting in the painting.
Whoa. Inception.
Our vantage point puts us at the top of Mount Holyoke, where a summit house had been built. And as Cole looks back up at us, he seems to have a question. Which way are we going to go as a country? Are we going to let our natural landscapes remain wild, or are they going to be sacrificed in the name of expansion and industrialization? Even the oxbow shape of the river, where the nickname comes from, has been interpreted by many to be a question mark. Cole's other major work, called The Course of Empire, can also give us some insight into his feelings about expansion. It's a set of 5 canvases that he painted right around the same time as the Oxbow, and it depicts the rise and fall of a glorious and decadent civilization. It's more clearly critical of expansion, and it bolsters the theory that the traditional interpretation, that manifest destiny interpretation of the Oxbow, is actually incorrect. It almost seems like the Oxbow has been hijacked to support some ideology that it was never intended to support. So my final question is this. To what extent should a viewer impose their own meaning on a work of art? Now, plenty of modern artists create intentionally ambiguous works of art because they actually want the viewer to bring their own experience and create their own meaning. But is it fair to look at the Oxbow and see manifest destiny, even if that wasn't Cole's intent? All right, so let me know what you think. Hit me up with your favorite landscapes, and maybe we'll talk about them in another episode. Just remember, landscapes may appear boring, but usually there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. Thanks for watching.